If you're looking for a small crossover with high reliability and high fuel efficiency that also has a luxury badge on the front, you might want to check out one of these. This is the 2025 Lexus UX. For this model year, it's received a few exterior tweaks and some bigger interior changes and a new hybrid system under the hood. And that hybrid system is what makes the UX unique in this segment, because the hybrid system is standard and every model will get over 40 mpg. That definitely makes this different than the new Acura ADX, which has to be the Lexus UX's direct competitor in the United States. That's brand new for 2025, and we are certainly going to be talking a lot about it in this video. Which one is right for you? Let's see if we can find out. The Lexus UX, or the Lex UX, as I have been known to call it now and then, debuted in 2018 as a 2019 model year vehicle, making this one of the older entries in this segment and one of the older Lexus models on sale in the US. That's why the front-end design looks like it's from a slightly different era, even though it has been tweaked over time. So we have the more distinctive spindle grille that really pops out of the bumper rather than merging into the rest of the bumper like we find, for instance, in the Lexus RX. I have to admit that from some angles, the UX can seem a little overstyled. It's like they pulled all the styling cues and ridges and creases from bigger Lexus models and stuffed them into a smaller format, so some of these style lines just come a little close together to my eye. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. We have the sporty squiggle spindle grille because this is an F-Sport trim, but I did notice that was really tricky to clean. And over the last week, we have received over 7 inches of rain out here in the forest, so things definitely needed to be cleaned. Full LED headlights here with LED fog lights below, a little bit more squiggle on the side, and kind of this interesting power bulge design in the hood line. Now, since the UX first launched, with hybrid and non-hybrid drivetrains, Lexus decided to go all hybrid in the UX. And again, that makes this very different than the other options in this segment, which are really not offered with a full hybrid at all. Some manufacturers may highlight mild hybrids, but it's not the same thing as a full hybrid like we find in the UX. Coming in at 177 inches tip to tail, this is right in the middle of the luxury subcompact SUV segment in America. This is a pretty broad segment and mostly defined by price, not size, which is why this is a direct competitor to the ADX, even though that ADX is quite a bit longer than this, almost 10 inches longer in reality. The ADX does have an awfully long hood and front overhang, but it does have a bigger body behind, so you will find a bit more room inside that Acura. I think the front-end styling of the Acura is better looking, but I think the back-end style is actually a little bit more interesting in the UX, depending on exactly how you feel about some of these overstyled elements. There's a lot of creasing going on, some big chunky fender flares here, and even these taillight modules you'll see in a moment that kind of swoop up, kind of like a manta ray in the ocean. As busy as the back end is on the UX, I think this is a little bit more interesting to my eye than the Acura ADX, which is a little bit too slab-sided, maybe a little plain Jane from some angles. This, whatever you think of the styling, is certainly not plain. We have folds, we have creases, we have lots of different materials combining, shiny black plastic at the bottom, a rough black plastic bumper, lots of body painted bits, big LED light bar running from one side to the other, and again, these really intriguing taillight modules. I'm surprised these didn't make their way into other vehicles. They are reminiscent of Cadillac's fins from yesteryear, or perhaps those Lady Gaga shoulders on that one music video that she put out. We have a rear wiper right there on the hatch, but I kind of wish it was tucked up under the spoiler, which is a bit more shiny black plastic, matching what's going on right down there at the bottom. Intriguingly, the hatch is quite high in the rear, really giving this a high-waisted look that I don't fully understand because it's not related to the position of the battery pack. The cargo area actually drops down to about there, so you do have to lift luggage quite high into the UX, higher than you would in some vehicles that have much more ground clearance than we find in this model. Ground clearance is relatively low in the UX compared to the competition because that's one of the ways we get to 40 mpg. While we're back here, I should mention that the power hatch does not like to be hurried. If you try and push on the power hatch, it A, doesn't go any faster, and if you push too hard, it actually thinks it hit something and then backs up. Now, speaking of the cargo area, let's talk about that while we're here. We have just over 17 cubic feet of storage space. No, that's not a typo. It's not a huge cargo area. We do have a little bit under that load floor, and then going further down the rabbit hole, we have this weird plastic divider, which does take up an awful lot of space that could be otherwise used for storage. Now that does lift up and out of the way, but as you can see, Toyota chose to put some of the electronics here, for instance, the cable that goes to the rear motor and some electronic module there, in the space where theoretically maybe you could have put a spare tire or some additional storage space, but in this model, we just have this series of dividers and layers. Over in the corner, we also have the 12-volt battery. I think that could have been put in a better location. On the other hand, you can drop the load floor into a lower position and reclaim a bit of that storage space. When Lexus first launched this vehicle, they offered a non-hybrid drivetrain, but I think wisely they realized that no other manufacturer was chasing fuel efficiency, so they made the UX hybrid only. And for 2025, they made it more powerful, 196 horsepower total from a 2-liter 4-cylinder hybrid system. I am a little bit surprised they didn't snag the 2.5-liter hybrid system from some of the larger models and try and shoehorn it under this hood, but maybe it wouldn't have fit. The engine itself produces 150 horsepower. When combined with the 2-motor generator units and the traditional Toyota Lexus hybrid system, we get 196 horsepower on the other side. Now, this model is an all-wheel drive model, so we also have a third motor in the back. That one's rated for 40 horsepower and 62 pound-feet of torque. That may not sound too exciting, but here's how the rear motor is used. It's mainly used at lower speeds, and think of it this way. If you are stuck or you need some extra traction, you can balance power 50-50 until you hit about 80 horsepower total, so right about half throttle in the vehicle. After that point, obviously you're going to get more power on the front axle, but you can still get that 40 horsepower, 62 pound-feet of torque through a reduction gear, of course, to the rear wheels. And that is more helpful than you might assume. But it is going to feel different than a traditional mechanical all-wheel drive system that we find in basically all of the competition. This hybrid system doesn't just get more power, it also gets a new battery for this year and fuel economy ratings that are class-leading. 42 miles per gallon all-wheel drive, 43 miles per gallon if you choose front-wheel drive. A hybrid system is the big glaring omission in the new Acura ADX. And as we're going to get to in the drive section, this hybrid system not only makes this about twice as efficient as the ADX in real-world driving, it's also significantly quicker 0 to 60, and that's perhaps a bigger deal. F-Sport doesn't just get you the squiggles up front, you also get the nifty F-Sport badge here, some interior tweaks, but importantly, you don't get bigger brakes or wider tires. These are 225 width tires riding on 18-inch wheels, basically the same size you find in the regular model. For a week behind the wheel, I'm going to give the front seats 8 out of 10 points. The driver's seat has two-way adjustable lumbar, and these are the F-Sport seats, so we have a little bit more bolstering on the seat bottom cushion. The front passenger seat does not have adjustable lumbar support at all. While I would prefer 4-way lumbar, at least for my height, it's in exactly the right spot. Maybe different for you though. We also have a powered tilt telescopic steering column, something that we don't find in a lot of the competition, and that's memory linked to a 3-position memory over there on the driver's door. As far as the seating position goes, it is definitely more reclined and more sedan or hatch-like than the average entry, especially from Europe in this segment, but it's a little bit more upright actually, I think, than the Acura ADX. Headroom though, that's a little limited both in the front and in the rear. If I put this seat all the way down, I have maybe an inch and a quarter of clearance, but sitting in a position where I would feel more comfortable, my hair is almost brushing the ceiling. The back seat, though, that is definitely where things start to get really tight. With the front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have only about an inch and a half of room left. And as you can see, it's just not possible to get over to this seat because the front seat is all the way back in its tracks. And that just means if you're a taller driver or have taller passengers up front, you're not really going to be able to put people in the back. And the middle seat is quite tight because the UX is on the narrow side for this segment. You really would not be able to put a rear-facing child seat behind a driver of my height safely, and even a shorter driver or shorter front passenger could get things a little bit complicated because remember, you do need about an inch of clearance between a child seat and a front seat. Now, the rear, we do have side impact airbags, which is a nice touch. I'm sitting basically on top of the new lithium-ion battery, and headroom, it's okay. It's on the low end of the segment, but you know, I still have about half an inch left. As with every other Lexus sold in the United States right now, the UX comes with a ton of active driver assistance and active safety tech standard. And a lot of these systems are optional on the European competition, especially adaptive cruise control and blind spot monitoring, which you will find even on a base UX, but you won't find in that Volvo XC40, which has always struck me a little funny that we don't have all of those safety systems standard in a brand that's safety obsessed, but we do, of course, over here with the Lexus. Same thing goes for the Acura, actually. Very similar safety content on both the ADX and the UX for 2025. Moving to the ceiling up front, we find the controls for the optional moonroof. We have slide-to-the-side sun visors with vanity mirrors and lights on both sides. The moonroof is a pretty typical size, so not a panoramic design like we find in some of the competition. We have height-adjustable shoulder belts and height-adjustable head restraints for the driver and front passenger. Since we're in the F-Sport trim, we have the F-Sport logo embossed on those. It may be difficult to tell on your screen, but the seats have kind of a two-tone vibe going on. This center stripe of perforated material, which is not real leather, by the way, that has red accents inside those perforations to give this a very subtle stripe theme that kind of goes with the contrasting stitching on the side. As you can see, the bolstering on the seat back and seat bottom cushion is definitely more aggressive than we find in the Acura ADX, and I find these seats, again, quite comfortable. They really hold you in place if you do plan on driving a little bit more spiritedly, although they could be tricky given the tire size we find on the outside. Now, over on the door panels, we find lots of soft touch materials and some touches borrowed from larger and more expensive Lexus models, like these door handles that are definitely reminiscent of what we find in the Lexus LC. The dashboard style, that may not be everybody's cup of tea, but I think that the parts quality and the fitment quality is actually better than we find in the Acura ADX. We also find really big screens, something we don't find in that Acura model. Now, these are the optional screens. You do find a smaller LCD touchscreen here and a smaller instrument cluster in the base UX models. But they were actually running basically the same software. So if we take a look outside of CarPlay, which, by the way, actually can be expanded to use the entire screen if you want to, just for giggles there. But if we go back to the native interface, this is very much like the smaller screen. It's literally just on a bigger screen that takes up more of the dashboard. This is one of the more recent changes in the UX. Below that, we have two big air vents there, sort of a piano key style control for the 2-zone automatic climate control. Down below that, we find USB USB-C charge-only ports, a button for the electric parking brake, that's automatic start-stop button there for the engine, Qi wireless charging mat, two big cup holders, but the location of these keys can mean that larger drinks, especially those large takeout drinks, can actually interfere with those buttons, so keep an eye on that. You'll see the floor mat there, Sport UX, since we're in the F-Sport model. Bin style and slot style glove compartment. Sorry, apologies. Mostly a slot style glove compartment, but I did try and stick a tablet computer inside. My 11-inch iPad would not fit in there. Back to the center console, we have the sort of traditional Lexus hybrid shifter with drive, sport mode down there, park there. Buttons for the seat climate, heating and ventilation. Also the heated steering wheel, an EV mode button. You can see my little USB cable dangling out of there because we have a USB interface port for the system in this center console storage area. The vehicle does support wireless CarPlay, but it also supports wired CarPlay, so you have the choice. And then we have this tiny little storage cubby here for, I don't know, maybe a ring or something like that, if you're willing to risk getting that lost in the cabin. Over on the driver's side, we have something that you won't find in the ADX at any price, and that is a full-color head-up display. Don't worry, it looks bigger in person. For some reason, cameras always seem to shrink that image. One thing that has not shrunk, though, are these buttons on either side of this binnacle. This is definitely a previous generation Lexus touch. They are vaguely reminiscent of the bolts in the neck of Frankenstein's monster. On this side, we find a button for the stability and traction control system. There's no knob or ring there. On this side, the ring does actuate different drive modes, but then we also have a button at the end for the normal and custom drive mode. Below that, we find a full LCD instrument cluster. This is the larger of the two LCD clusters offered in the UX. This is also the most configurable, so you can choose what you want in the center section there. You can rotate around, for instance, map displays, and then you can choose what you want in each side of that as well. The steering wheel, that has not really changed, so we find controls for that multifunction LCD cluster over here, volume up, down on there as well, track forward, backward on that side, and then paddles on the back. Paddles on the back of an eCVT-style planetary power split hybrid, they're not the most useful, but they're not quite paddles on a poodle like they are in many CVTs. You can still use them for giving you more regenerative braking and more engine braking going downhill. On the sound system front, this has a Lexus-branded premium audio system that's definitely not quite as nice as the Bang & Olufsen audio system that we find in the new ADX, but as you can see, the counterpoint to that is you may not like the styling, but the fit and finish and attention to detail and assembly quality in here is definitely better than what we find in the Acura. Fortunately for Lexus, but a little bit less so for Acura, I'm driving this the same week that I just drove the ADX, and I also had the Honda Civic at the same time. So those vehicles are definitely on my mind at the moment. And for anybody out there complaining, why is he talking so much about the ADX? Well, Comparisons are everything. How does this perform without talking about how the competition performs is, in my opinion, absolutely meaningless. And here's part of why. The ADX, really slow. Honda Civic Hybrid, actually surprisingly quick. This, somewhere between worlds. If I floor it, we get a surprising amount of front wheel action, especially if the road surface is less than perfect, and then we get 0 to 60 times that are notably quicker than that ADX. This model ran 0 to 60 in 7.8 seconds. And because this is not actually a CVT, this is a planetary power split hybrid system, kind of a mouthful, which is why sometimes it's abbreviated CVT, it changes ratios much more rapidly. So if you floor it, you get a lot more power and a lot more quickly than you get in the Acura ADX, where you do have to change ratios, and you get a bit more torque out of these motors as well. So it's not just about 0 to 60 time, it's also about passing power, which honestly felt pretty darn sluggish in the ADX, especially once we were up at around 3,000 feet. Here, I'm at about 1,500 feet, still feels pretty peppy. Now the braking score, that's the downside, thanks to the tires. 125 feet from 60 to 0 in relatively dry conditions. And that's part of why we get the excellent fuel economy, but also why we get that front wheel peel when you accelerate that you don't find in all the competition. The tires and the tire compound and the weight of the UX also affect the handling score. When it comes to handling, I'm going to give this a B. It feels direct, it's not as engaging as the ADX or the Volvo or the BMW, etc., but it's not necessarily bad. For the UX, it's mostly about grip, or a lack thereof. Fortunately for the Lexus, grip levels can be improved by swapping in some better tires, and I would say that's worth it on the UX. You may give up a little bit of fuel economy, but the suspension is relatively well designed, and I think it would definitely accommodate some grippier tires. On a road surface like this, the compact dimensions and the low center of gravity and the low seating position make you want to drive this a little bit harder than the tires would otherwise be able to handle. Ride quality is definitely a little above average in the UX for this segment. A lot of the European competition especially is tuned towards the firmer side of things. Even in this F Sport trim, the ride is quite comfortable. And you can thank the slightly higher profile tires and the general suspension design for that. Now, if you want to compare the UX to something like, I don't know, a Mazda CX-30 or perhaps a Mazda 3, you should know that those don't have fully independent rear suspensions. And even though this is not the sportiest suspension tune out there, this definitely handles these imperfections, speed bumps, freeway expansion joints, etc. without the rear suspension getting upset, and that's not something that happens in the Mazda. There's a reason the Mazda is less expensive, and that is one of those reasons. You get a less elegant suspension design. So even though this is not the sportiest option, you can push this harder without having the suspension feel a little bit light and a little bit floaty in the back, or having the rear end skitter across pavement like you can sometimes get in the Mazda. This is a good place to talk about the all-wheel drive system. If I floor it, we are going to get front wheel slip, and then we're going to get power going to the rear wheels. So we do get, again, that extra torque going to the rear. The difference in a system like this versus a mechanical system like you'd find in most of the competition, well, basically all the competition except for a plug-in hybrid Tonale, is that you don't have to dig deeper into the throttle in order to get power to go to the rear. You just have to have slip on the primary drive axle. So in something like an ADX, if you get one front wheel starting to slip, it's going to lock the clutch pack, start to send power to the rear axle without digging deeper into the throttle. In this, you get a little bit of that, but if you want the most power to go to the rear, you have to keep pressing deeper into the throttle, and that's going to yield a slightly different feel on snow, ice, sand, etc. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, I measured 73 decibels in here. We do get a little bit more wind noise and road noise than I had expected, and it's worth noting that if you push the engine harder, you do get some of that engine into the cabin, but it's a little bit less gruff sounding than Lexus's new 2.4 liter 4-cylinder turbo, interestingly enough. The counterpoint to that is, of course, fantastic fuel economy. We've been averaging 39 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving, and on our usual fuel economy test loop, I was able to get 45 miles per gallon out of this vehicle. That's way above the 42 mpg EPA score, and significantly better than in the Acura ADX. Actually, significantly better than basically anything in this segment that is not a plug-in hybrid. And even actually the plug-in hybrids don't do that well. Oddly enough, the only small crossover that had the fuel economy to compete with this was the Volvo XC40 plug-in hybrid, which was never sold in the US and is no longer sold anywhere for some reason. It had a relatively small plug-in hybrid range, but truly fantastic fuel economy once that plug-in hybrid range was exhausted. On the downside, it never offered all-wheel drive. Back in 2018, when I first drove the UX, it didn't matter whether you got the hybrid or the non-hybrid, both models were slugs when it came to acceleration. This is not exactly speedy, but 7.8 seconds is pretty reasonable for this segment, and I think it's really a non-issue, especially when you factor in the incredible fuel economy and the fact that you're going to be paying an awful lot more for better performance in the competition. Yes, you will go faster in a Volvo XC40. Yes, you can get a rear-wheel drive one. You can get an electric one. You have turbochargers in pretty much all the European competition. There's even a plug-in hybrid out there from Alfa. But none of them are going to be as reliable as this, and none of them are going to cost as little as this to keep around. I'm not just talking about fuel economy, I'm also talking about the expected maintenance and, of course, long-term expected repair costs, which are generally speaking lower on the UX than all the competition. So, bottom line, I think Lexus did exactly what they needed to do as far as the vehicle itself. Let's talk about pricing though, because the pricing is a little bit higher than some people might like, but actually there are certain models that are still right in line with, yep, again, that Acura ADX. Versus a lot of the options in this segment, the Lexus UX has a big advantage when it comes to price. The UX starts at $37,715, and if you get carried away with all the options, you'll end up at just under $50,000. That's definitely a narrower range than we find especially in the European set. Keep in mind that some of these European options offer electric versions and they're excluded from this pricing chart. Most notably the Volvo XC40. Its electric option has now been renamed the EC40, but if you want an option in this segment that's fully electric and wicked fast, you could definitely look at that XC40, or you could even look at the less expensive EX30, which we actually happen to own, and be sure and stay tuned because there is a comparison video on these two vehicles coming out soon. Bottom line, the EX30 is less expensive. Right now it's about $47,000, but there is a lease credit on it, so it will probably lease less expensive. But it is smaller, and there are certainly some compromises and things to keep in mind. We also have the Mini Countryman, which is one of those premium branded vehicles, not exactly a full-on luxury set. But interestingly, BMW doesn't make it that much less expensive than its closely related model in the lineup, the X1. So you just have to choose whether you like the Mini styling or the BMW styling, because you'll find them basically on the same dealer lot. You should also keep in mind that the Lexus NX has a reasonable amount of pricing overlap with the Lexus UX. You can even buy an NX 350h for $46,600 including destination, just barely within the top range of the Lexus UX. But let's dive into the competition now. Clearly we need to talk about the best seller in this segment first, which is the Volvo XC40 still. Although I wouldn't be surprised if the Acura ADX ended up being the best seller by the end of 2025, mainly due to its low price tag and the fact that Acura has had a really good run selling the Integra, and I think a lot of that is going to rub off on the ADX. You can think of the ADX as the oversized Integra, but let's get to the Volvo. I think the XC40 looks fantastic. It is also a good drive. It's also well priced for a European option in this segment. The price tag doesn't go up as high as the BMW, and it certainly doesn't go up as high as the Mercedes options that we're going to skip over in this video, because the GLB and the GLA get really quite expensive, especially when we're talking about comparably equipped vehicles. If you love the Mercedes, there's a lot to love, but there's also a lot of price tag there to contend with. Again, the electric version of the XC40 has now been renamed the EX40, so if you're confused when you're out there shopping on the lot, that's what's going on. The XC40 is relatively boxy and chunky, and that really improves the interior practicality of this model, certainly above the Lexus UX. If you want a bigger, more practical cargo area, if you want a regular mechanical all-wheel drive system, better driving dynamics, faster 0 to 60 performance, etc., you want to take a look at the Volvo. If you want better fuel economy and statistically better reliability, you want to take a look at the Lexus. Next up, we have the Cadillac XT4, which has historically been the second best seller in this segment, which is why I was surprised that Cadillac decided to discontinue it. It is still on sale, but they're not making any new models. And that's a pity, because the recent refresh of the XT4 really brought its interior in line with some of the European options, especially if you're looking at the upper end trims where you now have stitched inserts in the dashboard made of pleather with actual stitching in there. It really dressed the interior up, as did the new LCD technology inside the dash. But unfortunately, Cadillac has decided to reorient themselves and go all in on EVs. So by the end of this year, every SUV in their lineup, except for the Escalade, will be an electric vehicle, and there's actually an electric Escalade as well. And then very shortly thereafter, everything in the Cadillac lineup is going to be electric. They're actually beating Volvo to that electrification goal. Volvo's actually dialed that back a little bit. If you can get your hands on an XT4, keep in mind that it is big on the outside. It's not as big on the inside as you might think, but it's still pretty roomy, and there are lots of deals to be had. So if you're willing to haggle, you can likely find a better deal on it than on the UX or the XC40. And that really compensates for that higher price tag, the higher MSRP that you might see on some XT4s. Representing Germany, we have the BMW X1. The bottom line here is pretty easy. If you want better handling, better performance, more options, a better quality interior, and I think a more attractive look, you want the BMW X1. On the other hand, it's going to cost you more, it's not going to be as reliable, and it's going to cost you more to maintain, insure, and just keep around generally. If you want electric options, there are some other electric options from the European competition, most notably the electric GLB, which is the EQB in the Mercedes lineup. But the big thing to know is that whether we're talking about the BMW or the Mercedes, you're going to be paying more for the German options than for the Lexus UX. But you're going to get something that's a little bit more SUV shaped, SUV styled, and SUV capable as well, because those mechanical all-wheel drive systems certainly are going to be more capable than what we find in the Lexus UX, and that really goes for a lot of these options, whether we're talking about the XT4, the XC40, the X1, the GLB, etc. The mechanical all-wheel drive systems are going to be superior in terms of capability to the all-wheel drive setup that we find in the Lexus UX, and you get more ground clearance. The UX really looks and feels like a lifted hatchback, and that's not necessarily a bad thing depending on what you're looking for, but it doesn't have the ground clearance and capability that we find in some of the options. And that's one of the reasons that I think that the ADX is its truest direct competitor, not just of course because Acura and Lexus have traditionally been classic head-to-head competitors in every segment that they compete together in. Of course, they don't have lineups that exactly meet, but where those lineups do intersect, they're often the top cross-shop for each of these brands. And that sort of makes sense here. The ADX also gives off a not quite SUV vibe. Acura is calling it an SUV, but it really is more of a lifted sportback in terms of its general profile and its general construction. It's of course closely related to the Honda HR-V and the Acura Integra. It shares engines and transmissions with the Integra, only you get all-wheel drive in the ADX and you don't get that in the Integra. Now on the downside, we don't have a huge amount of power, 190 horsepower. This is a little bit heavier than you might think because the size of the ADX is larger than you might think. It's quite a bit bigger than the Lexus UX, quite a bit bigger than average in this segment. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's that much bigger on the inside. The inside is roomier than the UX and roomier than a lot of the competition when we're talking about legroom, but especially second row headroom is a little bit more limited in the ADX because of that sloping sportback profile. We do get the practicality of the hatch and a really long cargo area. So depending on the kind of cargo you're carrying, it could be more or less practical in the ADX than some of the other options, but that somewhat sportback shaped rear end does limit practicality versus some of the really boxy back ends like we find in the XC40 or perhaps the BMW X1. The big disappointment for me with the ADX was that you cannot get Honda's excellent two-motor hybrid system, and that really would have been a novel thing for the ADX. As it is, the ADX is relatively slow. It is slower than the UX. It actually is one of the slowest, if not the slowest entry in this particular segment in terms of 0 to 60, in terms of passing power, etc. I think the feel is good, the handling ability is good. I like the design both inside and outside. I could have wished for bigger screens on the inside, maybe the new Acura MDX's infotainment system jammed into the dashboard rather than basically borrowing from the Honda lineup, the screens and the software there. But minor complaint there, I don't think too many people are going to notice. I think more people are going to care about the performance or lack thereof, and you don't have the fuel economy to compensate for that like you do in the UX. And bear in mind the UX is actually a little bit quicker 0 to 60. If Acura could swap in the Honda Civic's two-motor hybrid system, everything would change. Because that Honda Civic Hybrid can go 0 to 60 well under 7 seconds, and that would make this one of the faster entries in this segment. But as it is, I think it's a pretty close tie. The big thing that the ADX has going for it is the fact that it's really inexpensive. If you take a look at the MSRP here, the ADX tops out at $43,950. You're probably going to get a slightly better deal on it than you will on the Lexus dealer lot, and the Lexus goes up to about $50,000. You also get more interior room. So if you're looking for legroom, the ability to put adults or child seats in the back, it's going to be a lot easier in the ADX. We get a bigger cargo area. It's a more practical interior as well. I also like the handling feel in the ADX better than the Lexus UX. The problem is, again, performance and fuel economy, and those are two things that the UX does strangely well, especially considering where the UX started. Because when the UX first launched, it was really quite slow, whether we're talking about the hybrid or the non-hybrid, and thankfully they have addressed that with the latest hybrid system. Hopefully there's another next generation UX coming soon that will take things to the next level.
But you also should keep in mind the Lexus NX, because the NX starts at $42,140, and again, there is an NX 350h with a lot more power, better performance, and decent fuel economy, actually quite similar fuel economy, for only about $46,600. It won't have all the bells and whistles on it that a loaded UX might have on it, but I would probably go for the NX instead of the UX if you could afford that extra $10,000 bump over the base Lexus UX model. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and of course stay tuned for all of our upcoming videos. See all of you next week.